So I'm just going to wrap up the lecture on perspective and space, since there was very, very little left for me to say when I got cut off at 10 minutes. Um, and then I'm going to move on to talking about the final lecture, which is talking about the study impulse. So yeah, I just basically wanted to talk a little bit about some contemporary artists that I admire and think have beautiful work, who are really interested in kind of space and space systems, such as perspective, suggestions of perspective systems. With each of these, you can see that they're less, they're not like slavishly following perspective systems. It's more about manipulating and playing with them for illusion and for effect. Um, and yeah, that's such a beautiful piece. And so Julie Moretu and then Sarah Morris also. Um, I love these. Some of these are based off of spaces of specific. A lot of them are based off of specific airports she visits, and then studying some of the architecture of the spaces, and then kind of abstracting them down to just these negative space bars cutting across these color panels, and the implications of the spaces. It's pretty neat. Okay, so that's the end of that lecture, and I'm going to end that show and then just start the very next lecture. So, talking about perspective then automatically leads to talking about the next art impulse that I wanted to talk about, which is the desire to study things. I think that that's been connected to artists making art for a very long time, probably longer than many of us think. Part of that is because to get good as an artist, it often requires a certain amount of studying both just the conventions and styles of your time, and also studying nature, studying the world around you, and such as this New Kingdom painting, fresco painting, which is a pretty old example of an artist showing like real careful observation of the natural world. And especially when we get to the Renaissance and post-Renaissance in Europe, we see many artists where studying the world, studying the natural world and other parts of the world, is a very major part of why they make art, and also a part of their process to make art. So, just last lecture we looked at this perspective drawing. I talked about the sort of maniacal, obsessive compulsive nature of Thomas Eakins, such a perfectionist. And then here I wanted to show you how you could see that the result of that work, that his very careful observation led to really being able to think about that very subtle change in scale, and how those shifted back in space. And here's another example of, that it's not just in the 19th and 18th century, but going all the way back to 14th century BCE or 12th century. I can't remember now. What we have here is, very, very careful observation of the natural world. In fact, actually, I believe I've read that biologists are able to identify almost every single species of bird that's contained in this hunting scene. Someone like Albrecht Dürer would very carefully observe the natural world around him. Right. This is a beautiful watercolor slash drawing, but he's not the only one to work on looking at, let's say, finding a dead bird and trying to examine its wings. Here we have an example from the 19th century, Edward Burne-Jones. Here's another couple of examples of Dürer doing nature studies. A beetle, and once again, this is another example of botanists are able to study this painting and identify. there's supposed to be like a really amazing number of different species of grasses and plants contained in here, and the accurate depiction of each one of them. Um, so, pretty impressive. And landscape, I think the very genre of landscape painting comes out of this desire to study, I think, because some of the very earliest landscapes we see are sketchbook, travelogue landscapes. People, as they are journeying places, they make little landscape sketches of this is what this space looked like, and this is what this place looked like. So like Dürer, Leonardo da Vinci was an artist who very much put his study and his sketchbooks as a high value in his body of work. And you know, I often say in class that if the only thing we had from Leonardo da Vinci was his sketchbooks, he'd still be really one of the most important artists, definitely one of the most important Renaissance artists. So one of the things that the importance of study did, especially more and more after the Renaissance's artists were making more figurative works and felt more and more that they needed to understand anatomy, we see over and over again this connection between artists and the medical community, where artists felt like they needed to participate in studying cadavers with medical students in order to better understand anatomy. And because of that connection, we see a number of times artists such as Rembrandt here or Thomas Eakins, where they are making paintings about the study of medicine and the study of anatomy. Here's another example of the same kind of idea in a different way. John Constable was a landscape painter, and for him the atmosphere of the sky and the different moods of the sky were incredibly important in his paintings, and so he devoted himself to on an almost daily basis making cloud studies and studying just different kind of cloud moments. And it was said that oftentimes he'd just, you know, see a peak of the sky and be like, oh, I have to capture that, run outside with his paints to make sure he got a study down. And now those paintings, the ones he did, that I think it, you know, many people feel like that the cloud studies he did, he didn't think of them so much as works of art, but more as just, you know, forms of study. These are some of his most beloved paintings. Here's a very different approach or a different example of the importance of studying for artists. Géricault, in those last years of life, he had a friend who was the director of an insane asylum, and he convinced this friend to let him spend weeks just not living in, but like visiting the insane asylum and interviewing people who lived there and drawing and painting portraits of them. And his goal was to, you know, to paint a portrait of each person that had each kind of madness. I don't think he really completed that project. I think to a certain degree, he probably kind of realized that they were more portraits of the people than they were of the condition. But that was his initial goal, at least. And also photography, and we haven't talked about photography yet. That'll be in the next unit, the whole history of photography. But photography became another means by which artists could study things. One of the most notable examples is being able to study motion and being able to see things that they were never quite sure was true. Most notably, that one of the things that led to Muybridge being able to do this, he was financed by the fact that two men made a bet, and the bet was over whether, when a horse is at full gallop, whether there's any moment where none of the horse's feet are touching the ground. But before that, people didn't really know how a horse ran. We didn't truly understand the structure or nature of that. And here's my last example. I like this both because it's about study, but it's also about artists studying how other artists studied. So these are color studies. Each one is based on a different painting by Turner. And Turner made lots of color studies himself and made